Want to see how to use MongoDB and MySQL from the same SpringBoot project? Let me show you how. Okay, so let's start by creating a new project. I'm going to create a project named MultiDB. I'm going to use Java, Maven, Java 1.8. I'm going to make a jar. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll use SpringBoot 2.7.1. I'll add in Lombok. I'll add in Spring Web. I'll add in SQL, JPA and MySQL driver. And I'll add in NoSQL. We'll add in MongoDB. Okay, these should be the dependencies that we need. I'll say create. Okay, we have our initial project created, and we're going to run that just to make sure everything's okay. We'll enable Lombok, and the first thing we see happens is it got an error because we don't have a database set up. So let's quickly go through our application properties and let's set up a database. So we can go to source, main, resources. We can go to application.properties. So in here, we know that our server port is already set to port 8080, but I'll just identify that in here. And then we need to add some information for MongoDB and MySQL. I have MongoDB running locally, so I'll use a local instance of MongoDB. And I have MySQL running locally, so I'll use the local information on that as well. For my MongoDB, we need to set the MongoDB URI and also the database I'm going to use. For our MySQL, we need to set a few properties for that. For our MySQL, we need to add in a URL, and I'll use localhost, and I'll have a database called sales, and then I have a username and password for my localist root and root 123. In addition, I have to set a couple Spring dialect properties and Hibernate properties. So we'll add those in there. And for our MySQL, we want to create the entities when I run that. I think it's actually Delta 123. Here we go, update the password correctly. And I need to add in here one more item, and this will actually have it create the schema. So I need to have a database called sales, and on my MongoDB, I need to have a database called analytics. So let's go through and try to start this up again. Okay, I can go into our Studio 3T and look at my analytics database, and I have a basic collection in there. Okay, let's start the application just to make sure everything's working. Great, everything starts up okay. So now we can go through and start adding some code. We're going to go into the Java main. First thing we're going to do in here is add another package called config. And in this config, we're going to add a Mongo configuration. What this Mongo configuration is going to do is when we start creating objects in the database, by default, what happens is it adds an underscore class in there, and we don't want to do that. So we're going to add this configuration in here so it doesn't do that. So this is for the MongoDB to remove that underscore class. Again, this is just added into a configuration folder. Now that we have that, we can take the next step, and we have configured our MySQL database and our MongoDB connection. We can actually start going through and creating some objects. So let's go through and create a model folder. So we'll add a package, model, and I'm going to create two types of models. I'm going to create a user model. I'm going to create an analytics model. So the user model is going to actually be a traditional entity, and within that entity, I'll need to define this as, I'll use @data for the Lombok for my getters and setters. I'll define this as an entity, and then I'll say the table name, and this is going to be what it is in the database itself, and I'll say users, lowercase, and I'll import this table annotation. Okay, now it's giving me an error right here, and to start with, we need to have an ID. And this ID is going to be a private string ID. Okay, and then we'll also have a couple columns in here. So I'm going to add an email, first name, and last name. I'm going to keep it very, very simple. And we'll pop those in there. So we don't have to add getters and setters because we're using long block. So that's the first thing that's awesome for us. Now that we have this in here, since we have given the annotation or the configuration for the DDL auto to update, it'll actually create this user entity for us. Okay, now I defined this right here as a string, but I don't want to actually go through there and have to create the IDs. I want to auto-generate that. So we have one thing that is very nice that we can use in JPA, and that's to auto-generate that off a UUID. So we can do that using a couple annotations, and I'm just going to drop these in here. So I'm going to say generated value based off UUID2. Generator name is UUID2. Strategy is org.hibernate.id.UUID generator. That way, we're not creating a sequential ID like a lot of people do from the database, which is very prone to attacks. If you have user number 1, user 2, user 3, then someone without proper authentication could quickly get more information on your users. So now that we have that cleaned up, we can go to the analytics entity. And the analytics entity is a little bit more interesting because it's going to be referenced for a document. So for a document, we need to have a couple other annotations in here. We're going to add the data to get long block in here, a no-arg instructor, an all-arg constructor, and we're going to use @document. So the @document is the key to what we need. In addition, we need to have an ID. And this ID is going to be auto-assigned by MongoDB. So in here, what we're going to do is create some users, and this is just going to be user analytics to track what's going on. We're going to have private string user ID, and we'll have a private long user count, and we'll just leave it at that. So this is just going to be an analytics that we add just to show that we're adding something into the MongoDB. It's going to be user login count. There we go. Okay, so now we can take the next step and let's create a basic controller. We'll create another package for controller. I'm going to create a user controller, a user REST controller. And in here, I'm going to be very, very simple. Create a REST controller. We will have a request mapping, API/v1. And in here, I'm going to have a GET request. And this GET is going to simply be getting a user. So we're going to have a public string get user. We'll return something. And then we'll also have a post where we'll have a create user. So we'll add /user. I'm going to make that plural. This is going to be get users. In this post, I'll add in public string create user. And in here, we'll actually go through and we will insert user into DB. On this get user, what we're going to do here is we're going to update count of user access. So the get user will actually increment the MongoDB analytics, and the create user will actually insert the user into the MySQL database. So for both of these, I will need a service. So let's go through and create another package called service. And so the first service I need is going to be a user service. User service. Second item I need is going to be a analytics service. All right. And both of these are going to be annotated as a service. And user service is going to be service. Okay, so now let's go back in our REST controller, and I'm going to just use a auto wired. I'm going to put in user service. Another auto wire, and I'll put in analytics service. Okay, and for our user service, we said we're going to insert this. Insert user. Since it's a user, we're just going to say insert. We're going to pass in the user. For our analytics service, we're going to increment. User access. So for our two services, we need to pass in, to create the insert, we need to have a user object. So since we have a post, we can have a request body, and that request body can be a new user request, and we'll pass that in to our service. Now we need to go through and create this DTO. So we'll create a package for DTOs. And within that, we'll now create an object for the new user request. And in that, I'll use @data. And then we'll put in here private string email address, private string first name, private string last name. And that should be everything we need for a user. Let's just verify that. Yep. Okay, so now we have the basic information for the user, and we can import this. And for our response now, I'll just say done. Just a string response right now. We don't have this implemented in the user service. Let's go into the user service. And for now, I'm just going to say void. We need to put in a user request. And in here, I now need to call a user repository. So we'll need user repository. And we'll need some sort of save in here. Okay, we have not set up a user repository yet, so we need to do that. So let's go through and create another package. Let's call this repository. Within that, let me create the user repository. Okay, and this is going to be an @repository, and in that, this is going to be an interface. And in here, we're going to use a JPA, and in here, we're going to extend JPA repository, and we're going to make this user, and we have to pass in the key type. In this case, it's a string. Let's keep a space right here. There we go. So we'll import the user and then import the JPA. And since I'm not doing anything else in here, I don't need any query selectors or anything. This is all I need to do. So let's go back to our service now, and we need to import this repository in here. I'm just going to use AutoWire for now. And now we should be able to just use save with our entity. That should actually save it in the database. So this wants a new user. So we need to actually create a user. And normally we would use a mapper, but since we don't have that, I can just use a set email, user set first name, set last name. Okay, so that creates our user in there. Now the next thing we need to do is increment our user access. So for this, to start with, I'm just going to add a record in here for the user access. So in our analytics service, we're going to add user access, and what we need in here is going to be the user ID. So to start with, we need to map our repository, and instead of a repository, we're actually going to use the Mongo template. So now that we have that, we should be able to simply do an insert with Mongo template, and we're going to insert some sort of string, and we need to give it a collection name. So I'm going to create a type up here. I'm going to call this analytic collection. And now I'll use this. And for our string, what do we actually want to put in here? Well, this is a JSON document. And if we remember, we defined a analytics model. So we can go to the analytics model, we can create this, and we can actually use that. So we know we need to set the user ID, and we know we need to set, in this case, the user login count. And I'll just say 1 for right now. So every time we have this entry, it'll actually get stored into the database. So we have an error to resolve in the controller. And this controller, we need to put in the user ID. I'm going to add that into the get mapping. And so every time I do this, I'll add in ID, and we'll add in here and in here we'll add in a path variable, and we need to give it a name and then a reference to a local variable where we'll use that. Okay, right. We added in Lombok, so we can add in SL4J, and in here we can actually log a little bit of information in here, log.info. I'm going to say get user ID colon user ID. So we'll know actually what it was called with, and the same thing on our create user. We're going to say create user, and we'll actually print out the new user. And since we're using a long block, it'll actually generate a toString for us. So I think we're pretty much set up here. We have this right here wrong. Okay, fix that. And I think we're set up and ready to run this. Let's go through and let's see if this works. Okay, we're up and running, and let's quickly go through and see if we can access our API. Our API should be at /API/v1 listing on port 8080. So let's do a postman. So let's quickly create a post on localhost 8080 API v1 users. And we have to create a body. This is going to be a JSON body, and we need to have email address, we need to have a first name, and we need to have a last name. All right, let's submit this and see what happens. It says done. We got a 200. Let's go in our database and see if we have a user or a sales. Oh, we can see our user was created for us, and we actually have that user created. So we know the MySQL section is working. And now that we have a user ID, we can go through and use that user ID, and we can go into our postman again, and now we're going to use this for a get and pass that in. So we can try this get request with the ID, and we got back at 200. Let's go through and go to our Mongo database and see if we have some content there. So let's query this content, and we can see that we have the MongoDB ID created, the user ID, and login count. Let's see if we can run this again. Let's do it 2 more times. Let's go back to our MongoDB, query this again. Now we see 3 records in here. So now we've very quickly created access to MySQL and MongoDB in the same SpringBoot project. All right, hope you enjoyed the project. Please subscribe, leave comments, and follow me. Thank you.